This episode of The World Stage is part of the series The Neighborhood from the NUPI-led project Re-engage. It is produced by ECFR and co-published by ECFR and NUPI.
Hello, and welcome to The Neighborhood, the podcast that explores how countries hoping to join the EU are navigating political change and outside pressure, and what that means for Europe's democracy and security. The Neighborhood is part of the Re-engage project and is published on ECFR On Air and NUPI's World Stage. I'm Jessica Hendrick, the researcher, producer, and host of the series. In the first two episodes, we looked at enlargement from the top down, from Brussels, from legislation, from the EU's annual report card. Today, we're shifting to how we actually study political behavior inside hybrid regimes, because it's this behavior on the ground that ultimately feeds back into EU decision-making. Re-engage is currently running one of the largest comparative research efforts of its kind, collecting original field data across 6 countries: Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And guiding much of this fieldwork is our guest today, NUPI's Morten Bøås, whose career has focused on understanding political order, conflict, and survival strategies in difficult environments around the world. Together, we'll go behind the scenes to explore how trust is measured when institutions are fragile, how data is collected during active conflict, and how these insights can help the EU avoid repeating past mistakes. Morten, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
You spent a lot of your career studying political systems where real dynamics of power don't necessarily match what formal institutions claim to be doing. Why is fieldwork still indispensable for understanding hybrid regimes? What do you see on the ground that simply never appears in official data, governance scores, or expert assessments?
I think what we see, a hybrid regime represents a very complex political environment where some decisions are taken in the formal institutions, but often some of the most important decisions are also taken much more informally. And people are living in societies that are much less transparent and predictable than the kind of situation that we face in our daily life. The state is not something I need to think very much about. The state is like a snow plow in front of me. I don't need to worry about it, but it's there and sort of, in a way, takes care of me. And of course, people prefer this kind of predictability. But what do you do when that is not the case? When the state is not something that you just can take for granted, but something that is in your face very often during the day, and not necessarily as a benevolent actor, but something that constantly needs to be, you need to engage with it. This creates a very different life world for people. And we see this to very different degrees in all these 6 countries where we are working. But we see this particularly in these types of societies where people tend to trust those things that are very close to them. We see this in all these 6 countries. I mean, when we ask people, who can you really trust? It's close relatives, close friends, perhaps people in your neighborhood. Even when we start moving towards, the municipality level, local government and so on, trust starts to decrease, and it decreases even more when we get into the national level of national institutions and national politicians, for example. Of course, people would like to have that kind of predictability that at least I have in my life. The question is, how do you achieve this if you don't trust national institutions, if you don't trust political parties, if you don't trust politicians in general? And why don't you trust them? We look at how these regimes has evolved almost from when the Soviet Union crashed and onwards. We look at specific projects, but we also felt it was necessary to get some systematic evidence about how ordinary people think about these processes. How do ordinary people think about issues concerning trust, distrust, disinformation, information? How do they think about what the government is doing on key performance governance indicators?
Well, let me jump in right there, because before we get more into things like disinformation and the trust within the countries themselves, and I want to reiterate here that the 6 countries that we're referring to are Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Those are the countries that the Re-engage project is studying. I can see how there are some common patterns, as you say, of this. There's less transparency, the informal decision-making, the lack of predictability, the need to, negotiate in daily life. And I kind of want to build on that before we go further into the structure of the survey to ask you, within these countries, a lot of political crises and security events have kind of rocked them since we started our project. And I wonder if you could speak a bit more to how the geopolitical moment has shaped some of these countries. I'm thinking Ukraine and Serbia, about how we looked at our research and how we may have even adapted part of our designs to fit the moment.
Of these 6 countries, if you talk about sort of the geopolitical shifts that we have experienced, nowhere do we see this more clearly than in Ukraine. When we started designing this project, there was war in Ukraine, but not the kind of war that we now see when we started thinking about this project. So, Ukraine stands out there as the most sort of critical case in that regard. That said, Ukraine is also, since it's now under attack by Russia, it also means that most likely this has galvanized at least a good majority of the Ukraine population. Ukraine is the hottest part of a much larger geopolitical conflict. That said, it wasn't a geopolitical tension in itself that caused the war. The war is the responsibility of Russia. That cannot be denied. Russia has attacked. This makes it more difficult to get an InfoWar campaign going, right? Because the Russian aggression against Ukraine has, of course, brought up a lot of unhappy memories in Ukraine about previous times that Ukraine has been under domination from Moscow. Some of these things that, Russia and Russian agents, some of the messages they are trying to sell online is perhaps most difficult to sell in Ukraine right now, and probably more easily be sold in places, let's say Georgia, for example. Serbia is interesting because there is often these tendencies to think about of the Balkan countries. Serbia is the one that leans most towards Russia. If we look at our survey data, when we ask people about these fictional but plausible vignette stories about economic crises and relief packages from abroad, where they are asked sort of to compare and evaluate a relief package from the European Union, from Russia, from China and Turkey. Very interesting in the case of Serbia. They don't trust anybody,
right?
Basically. They, at least on the population level, there is no leaning towards Russia that package is looked at upon as more favorable than any of the others. They simply don't trust anybody very much. And you can say that we see some of the same things on the elite level, on the regime level. There's a lot of things we could say about the Vučić regime, but it's not necessarily that it's sort of quite an elegant way of shopping around geopolitically and trying to maximize the fact that nobody is really entirely certain about where Serbia stands in this current geopolitical situation. Where we really saw something dramatically happen during our fieldwork in Serbia was the collapse of the roof of the train station in Novi Sad.
Mm-hmm.
That it was a tragedy, but it also created something that we have never seen before in Serbian history, that it has been extremely interesting for us to follow in this project together with our Serbian partner.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I know the Novi Sad has really changed things and the catalyst of this faceless movement, which we didn't necessarily anticipate at the start of the project. And in addition to that, I heard from some colleagues about, us conducting fieldwork in Ukraine and having air raid sirens going off. And I think that this is really crucial to understanding what we're studying, because if what we're studying is trust amongst such deeply polarized political environments, it must affect the structure of our data collection. And by that, I mean, we're using locally trained university students to help collect this data. And we are talking to people on the ground who are deeply impacted by, again, war and deep political crises. We're asking them, who do they trust? Who would they turn to in times of crises? This seems like it can be a bit of a cautious response at times from our respondents, or even from our locally trained enumerators. I wonder if you can shed some light on what that process looked like, if there were benefits or challenges of going with locally embedded enumerators to help us carry out our training. And also on the other side, from the respondents, Were they open, cautious? How did cultural norms or political fear kind of shape the data?
Yeah, what we decided to do, we wanted to do this service and we wanted to have them as representative as possible. What we decided to do that we wanted to do the capitals, 6 capitals in 6 countries, and 6 cities, which we defined as the secondary city. And this secondary city is a concept that comes from historical and sociology. The secondary city is not necessarily the second biggest city in the country, but it's an important city historically. In these cities, we have a total sample of around 600, 650 in each country, and it's enough to make this more or less statistically representative in these 2 cities. So we are not claiming that our findings are representative for the entire Ukraine, the entire Serbia, and so on. But for these cities, it would be, because we are using a quota sample based on gender, level of education, and age. They are students, and we train them. We train them for 3 days, train our local, researchers from our Serbian partners, Ukraine partners, and so on, so that they also can follow up with the students. The other part of your question was about cultural sensitivities. Are people ready to talk about these issues? And mostly they are. When people actually agree to do the interview, they are quite okay answering to these questions. Students are generally sort of highly valued and well-liked and trusted. And the fact that they are young, most of them, also means that people will have a higher trust in them. What we get back from the student interviewers is that people are quite willing to answer these questions and doesn't seem to hesitate too much, even when we ask them about including their own media habits and so on, and also their views and trust and distrust in political institutions and politicians in general. The only place where we see that there is, it's not a high percentage, but in the Ukraine data, on a few questions that probably were seen as a little controversial, because there we also asked some questions concerning their trust in military institutions, which obviously is an important case in the case of Ukraine, the fact that it's a war. That's the only place where we have, on a few of the questions in the Ukraine data, where there is about 10% of the respondents who have said that I don't want to answer that question. But it's only around 10%. The only place where this is visible is on a few questions in the case of Ukraine. They have no problems with questions concerning trust in media and trust in political parties, for example, which also in the case of Ukraine is very low. They trust the military as an institution and they trust the president. And apart from that, there is not much trust at all in Ukraine.
That's interesting. And I want to dig in a little bit more because I'm surprised to hear that Ukraine was really the only country in which this came up. I'm thinking the faceless movement in Serbia being led by mostly students and how that might have impacted having locally embedded students asking questions about the political context when, their generation is who's leading it. So were there any other kind of generational divides or areas for mistrust between the respondents and the people who we trained on the ground?
In the case of Serbia, we got a higher quality of the data due to the fact that the train station collapsed and this, I wouldn't call it faceless, I tend to call it a leaderless movement that has emerged. And it's very popular among ordinary Serbians. So and that also means that when young girls and also some young men come asking these questions and they are seen as the generation who is now taking the lead against this regime and this sort of almost national anger that emerged after the collapse of the train station, they are viewed very sympathetically. And there is this feeling in Serbia, we stand together and we are not afraid anymore. We will speak out. And they have been speaking out massively in these massive demonstrations against the regime. So in that regard, I think it only increased the quality of the data because the kind of fear that one sometimes sensed in Serbia earlier, before all of this happened, seemed to in some way has, if not vanished, at least decreased tremendously. And you mentioned this with sort of course, Ukraine is again a special case.
Right.
Because it is at war. And of course, that has made the whole fieldwork much more difficult. It has made the work in Ukraine, of course, extremely more challenging. But the place where we really have had difficulties is in Georgia.
Okay.
Where we, in fact, in the end, had to indefinitely postpone the fieldwork. Not the entire fieldwork, but we had to say to the students who did the interviews that, sorry, we cannot allow you to continue, because we knew about the foreign agent law, but when they strictly started to implement it, when our student interviewers were told that they would have to go individually to state offices and declare themselves as foreign agents, me and Maya and Pernille came to the decision very, very quickly that we cannot ask these people to continue this work. And they wanted to continue, but we said no. That said, I mean, we knew that this was coming, so the students were also willing to work very, very hard. So we managed to almost complete the sample before this draconian interpretation of the foreign agent law was put into process. But Georgia it's the only place where we have had so much difficulties that we actually had to say to stop that part of the process. We have managed the other things. We did the project process tracing and these kind of things in Georgia, but we lack around somewhere between, I don't remember precisely, but we lack 40 to 50 interviews in order to complete the full sample in Georgia. And most likely that is not going to happen because there is very little to suggest that the ruling party, Georgia Dream, is about to either reform or lose power, unfortunately.
Well, I just want to highlight, what the structure of the survey looked like, how these students were kind of using our tools to carry out these questions of trust and collect data at such an important time. And I wonder if we can just dive in a little bit further, because we use 3 main instruments to measure these questions within these 6 countries, 2 cities per country. I wonder if you can take us through each of those 3 instruments and kind of how do they complement one another and why did we choose them?
In order to do this, what you need is that you need to have a very good understanding of where did we get to where we are today. That means that we need to understand these societies historically, and particularly we need to understand what has happened since the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and forward. So that's the first thing we started with. Hybrid regimes that are some of them are now tipping, like Georgia, tipping very much towards the authoritarian, but it's not completely authoritarian yet. So it's this kind of regime that sort of exists in some sort of a limbo between, yes, there are still some rudimentary forms of democratic liberal rule, but there are also strong authoritarian tendencies in these states. This was sort of step 1A. Step 1B was then to look at, okay, how have the European Union dealt with these countries over time? Some of them have been and still are candidate countries, at least formally. That's the case of the Balkan ones. It's the case of Georgia was a candidate country. Moldova was a candidate country. We have looked at sort of what has characterized the EU programming during different periods of time, from the early optimistic days where it was sort of gung-ho. Now we are expanding liberally Europe. This is going to go fine. No problem. It's just a matter of some technical support and then this will sort itself out. To the kind of disillusionment that we have seen during the last 5-6 years, and then perhaps particularly after the full-scale attack by Russia on Ukraine, you saw sort of a turn to more, I would call it realpolitik, where the point is no longer necessarily about actual turning these into liberal democracies, but at least making certain that they don't turn the other way kind of policies.
Mm-hmm.
But the disillusionment still exists. And then we sort of, okay, now we have tracked the political evolution. We have tracked the EU evolution. We have a sense of what has been going on here politically, economically. We have a sense of how the EU, through its various programs, from both smaller, more sort of course, we cannot look at everything the EU has been doing. So we have looked at its rule of law projects and more sort of support to civil society, media freedom, these kind of things. We then selected in each country 2 to 4 projects that we wanted to look particularly at. Half of them should be rule of law projects, the other half should be civil society projects, more broadly defined. The rule of law projects tend to be very large. Some of them has been going on for almost decades. And hopefully, I mean, some of the research that we are doing here can hopefully help the EU not come to the answers, but perhaps ask some of the questions that they need to ask on some of these projects. 2 to 4 projects in each country. Then these projects needed to be of a certain size. They needed to have some sort of durability, and they couldn't be too old because we wanted to be able to identify who was involved on the EU side as funders, who had been involved as implementing actors, and who were the beneficiaries, what kind of local stakeholders, be it from the judicial side, for example, in Serbia or Bosnia, or from the civil society, say, in Moldova or whatever, had been involved in this, so that we could interview them. We interviewed these representatives separately. First, quite open-ended interviews about how they understood this project, why they have come about, what they wanted to achieve with them, what they thought had been achieved with them, and if there were certain sort of key points during the project that they felt were particularly important, in order to see that, okay, there we really managed to do something. That was a point of success. Other points would have been more sort of breaking points where things actually didn't work very well. So we did this then with EU people, implementing partner, with beneficiaries. We analyzed these interview data, and then we used that in order to design these focus groups where we brought them together. But they have been highly interesting because we have managed to get some sort of dynamic into them. There has been some very honest discussions here, and also points of controversy where suddenly I remember the one we did in Chisinau, where this veteran of Moldovan civil society activist who said, I need to declare this. I am 100% in favor of of Moldova joining the European Union. And then he turned around and pointed to the representative from the EU delegation present there. But he said, but you guys, he said, pointing out, you are killing local democracy in Moldova. If you want to build democracy in Moldova, it needs to be bottom up. What you should support is not all these large organizations based in Chisinau, he said, including my own. What needs support there is these local grassroots initiatives, very local women groups, youth groups, small civil society organizations that tries to sort of work on issues concerning democracy, but there is no way that they can be part of your programming because they don't understand the language and there is no way they can be part of this because they cannot deal with your audit and your financial reporting. So that was his point there, that the EU comes in large scale, where what is needed is sort of small scale building democracy on the ground. And I think this was an important critique, and I think the guy from the representative from the European Union, he was relatively shocked about this, but also tried to reply, and it ended up with, I wouldn't say that they agreed, but at least they understood each other. They understood each other's position. And there's a lot of data here and a lot of interview material. We have started now to work more systematically on it as we move towards sort of lessons learned, the comparative part of the project and so on. We really need to go into these in detail. The same is the case for which is the third component here, which is this Vignet service. That was designed in order to try to find out what do actually ordinary people think. Because after all, they are the most, I mean, if you are concerned with issues concerning trust, you are concerned with hybrid threats, you're concerned with trying to make democracy more sustainable, trying to turn societies into a slightly more liberal-minded nature, who will that depend on? it will not only depend on the elites and the support or non-support from Brussels, it will depend on ordinary people. And then we need to understand how they think about this. And in order to do this, we've designed it as a survey with these vignettes attached to it. And this means that it's a survey with a certain vignette experiment attached to it, where people are presented with what I call plausible but fictional stories. And we needed some sort of story that could work in all these 6 countries. Otherwise, it would not be comparable. And these are things that people can relate to, and that they do relate to them. So, and this is a way then of measuring also what external partners do they actually trust. And I think while there are some variations, I mean, by and large, I mean, people have more faith in the European Union than they have in other external partners.
Was there anything that surprised you or particularly stood out to you, whether that be the contrast between the different countries or how policymakers could interpret one of those insights?
There's more trust in what is close to you. So that people tend to trust, generally here, people tend to trust close relatives, close friends, close neighbors, and the further away things get from in distance, the less trust there is. This is what we expected to find. And it's more or less the same in all these 6 countries. There's a couple of things that is very interesting. I mean, for example, in the case of Serbia, like most other of these countries, has seen an incredible rise of what at least I personally will call sort of trash TV station, trash radio stations. I mean, to sort of serve the population with a sort of healthy menu of true crime, non-true crime, quiz shows, soft porn, and small news bulletins that are immensely biased towards whatever the owner would like to make people think. In the case of Serbia, quite a number of these has small news bulletins that clearly is biased towards Moscow's views on global affairs and to the regime's views on local affairs, to put it that way. And quite a lot of people report to see this quite regularly. What was interesting to note is that when we asked people, this was about their normal media habits. When we asked people, where would you go if a crisis emerged where you really needed to think, no, I need to have accurate information. And there was a drastic drop. Then there was a turn towards, which is all slightly biased, but it's less biased. That is Radio TV Serbia, but also to BBC World News, BBC Balkan News, which at least suggests that there is a certain kind of media literacy here, that one shouldn't be too concerned that people spend some time of the day on platforms that you and I may think are just garbage, because they may very well know that it's garbage, and they don't look at Happy TV, for example, in order to get news. They look at it, but it's not to get news. Serbia and the Serbian population is not very likely to sort of be a very strong ally of Russia. They see Russia as just another external player, and they don't really trust any of them. They don't necessarily trust the EU. They don't trust Turkey, they don't trust China, they don't trust Russia, they don't trust anybody. And you see the same thing in this leaderless or faceless movement, whatever we call it, the students here. I mean, they represent some of the same. They are not pro-EU, they're not pro-Moscow either. If they say they are anything, they would say, some of them, we have talked to a number of these people, some of them will say, I'm anti-war, they would say. But they are not pro-any. They are as critical to the Brussels as they are critical towards Moscow. And they are in many ways almost anti-system. They are not pushing for a program of reform beyond the fact that they want to have new elections and a new government. It's in a way, it's an anti-systemic protest, which in a way dovetails quite nicely with our findings from Serbia. This about we don't trust anybody, basically. But we trust the kind of movement that we are building here. And this idea that they are building a new Serbia to appropriate a new version of Serbian nationalism that is supposed to be inclusive and not exclusive, which also means that it's a joint sort of a Serbian nationalism that can also coexist with an inclusionary Bosniak nationalism, which is immensely interesting. It's really like a political laboratory, what is going on in Serbia right now. And in addition, I would like to point out Moldova, because Moldova stands out, and I really cannot explain it, but I think I believe in our data, because also the way we ask also people to self-identify politically, not with political parties, but as liberal, conservative, socialist, communist, and so on. And our results in that regard from belts and from Chisinau, it corresponds immensely nicely with the actual election results. Prior to the election, there were massive misinformation campaign, fake news campaign, and they spread like wildfire.
Right.
But if you look at the election result, it doesn't seem to have gained very much traction, but it did not affect their electoral behavior. And why is that the case? It's the case because when we looked at this, and Moldova stands out with relatively high trust in national politicians and relatively high satisfaction with key government performance indicators, like economy, like education, like infrastructure, and so on. And if you look at it, well, you could say, God knows if you ask me, but they are relatively satisfied with this. It's only on each of these key performance governance indicators, it's only somewhere between 8 to 12% of our respondents who report that they are extremely dissatisfied. These are the angry ones, the really angry ones. Most likely, in order to get a real traction on these massive disinformation campaigns, you need to have more people in that category. So the point here is not that everybody needs to be happy with the state of affairs. Not everybody needs to have a lot of trust. Not everybody needs to be very satisfied with key governance indicators. What you need to try to avoid is that too many people become extremely not satisfied, because they become the angry ones. And they are the angry ones where these kind of disinformation campaigns, it's among those groups that such campaigns really get traction. So in the case of Moldova, we could say that at this crucial point in time, the dam held. Unfortunately, we have absolutely no guarantee that it will do the same thing the next time there is an election coming up or something else happening.
Right.
But it points to something extremely important, because this is that don't be so concerned that people are not expressing very high levels of trust. What's important is to make certain that not too many people show absolutely no trust, no satisfaction at all. And how can we measure that? Well, you need to look at these key governance performance indicators. This also has huge bearing for where external actors that are interested in trying to prevent disinformation campaigns of this type to get hold, where they should invest their money. And that is in education, job creation, infrastructure, and so on. These are key governance performance indicators, meaning that probably a lot of the things that we do where we see little bang for bucks, like these endless rule of law projects that the EU has been involved in, maybe that is not where we should, what should be the key emphasis. Maybe there are other more tangible issues that should be addressed. And maybe the key thing to avoid is to have too many people in this completely dissatisfied, completely distrustful category, the angry one. How do you prevent that from happening? How do you prevent those that are I'm not happy, but I'm not unhappy either. I'm slightly dissatisfied. I slightly don't trust things. You have to avoid that category to sliding over into the angry ones. How can you avoid that? Key governance indicators that are tangible, that people actually see. Nobody sees judicial reform. Sooner or later, I mean, if it worked, you would see it, because then you would get a cleaner judicial system. But that may take 10 years. You need something tangible. But we have very interesting data, Jessica, and I think we will end up with both fascinating academic results, but also with, I think, if we play our cards right and do the analysis correctly, we will end up with some hopefully hard-hitting and provocative policy recommendations and suggestions for the EU, because I think that this is what is needed right now. One need to sort of probably break free of some of the conformity that has been around how one has dealt with this, how one has thought about this, and how one has studied this, and try to sort of push it into a new gear. And hopefully the Re-engage project can contribute to that.
Well, thank you, Morten, for breaking down from the high level of trust in politicians in Moldova to the Serbian anti-system. We can kind of draw out some recommendations for EU stakeholders, like governance indicators about infrastructure and education. And I'm really looking forward to, in future episodes, us diving further into those synthesized results that we will start to get to in January. And I want to thank you for taking us behind the scenes of the people and the human stories. As I said, in our episode ahead, we will travel to each case country to dive deeper on how citizens experience these reforms, pressure, and Europe's future and their daily lives. You can find links to Re-engage and all of our fieldwork updates in the show notes. And if you have enjoyed listening to this podcast, please let others know by writing about it on your social media page or on ours. But above all, hopefully, please give us a good rating and review on whichever platform you will use to download this podcast. For now, from Morten and myself, Jessica Hendrick, it is goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The World Stage. The episode is part of the podcast series The Neighborhood from the NUPI-led project Re-engage. It is produced by ECFR and co-published by ECFR and NUPI. Re-engage has received funding from the European Union's Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Programme.